Sometimes punishments just can't make up for the crime. Welcome, Mere Mortalites, to another round of the Mere Mortals book reviews. You do indeed have Kyron here today on the 4th of January 2024, welcoming in the new year with another book review live. I do have my co-host Juan in the chat and Johnny, so shout outs to them. And if you would like to join me here for a live book review, I always go live 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time on a Thursday, which is UTC midnight, wherever you are in the world, on a Wednesday, just plus or minus your time zone from that, and you'll be able to join us. So this is the book reviews channel for those who more are looking into perhaps some older classic books. We dive deeper into them. We try and get the juicy information, some themes, things you might not have realized, thought about, bring it all up to the surface, and we just talk books here. It's really, really fun. So what is today's book? Well, it's a little bit deep. It's a little bit dark, a little bit depressing, and I honestly was a little bit disappointed in it, but we'll get onto that soon. It is Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler. Difficult name to pronounce even in the German, Koestler, something like that. So this book was published in 1940 and is about 210 pages in length, so it was pretty reasonably quick to get through. Pages aren't super big or dense either. I'd say it was about 4 hours worth of reading for myself. What was my motivation, initial impression coming into this particular book? Well, I've never actually heard of Arthur Koestler before, and I'm not really sure why. The psychology of communism and its detrimental effects certainly do fascinate me. And I don't know. The book itself, after reading it, I probably can say, all right, I think I do know why this didn't capture me as much as I thought it would. Nevertheless, it's in a horrifying way. I probably should have come across this earlier, considering how much I am intrigued by these aspects of communism, the Soviet style of the show trials and all these sorts of things. So this book in particular starts off with this main character, Rubashov. And he's been thrown into a jail cell, and it's kind of like, oh, you know, what's going on here? What's he done wrong? And he then has like this little flashback to before he was thrown into the cell, and then he's back in the cell again. And then there's another flashback, and then it's like this alternating back and forth really quickly. At least in the first 30 pages, I would say 40, 50 pages, you just go through this back and forth. It's a bit of a strange style. Ultimately, I didn't find it that helpful to the story, and I'll talk more about this a little bit later, why I think this was actually somewhat detrimental to it. So let's jump onto the plot and style, and it's somewhat of a conglomeration of experiences of the Moscow show trials. So if you don't know about those were basically in the Soviet style era, and I'm thinking back to I'm going to say around like the 1940s in particular, maybe even a little bit before that or after that. This was when they were purging all of these people who were kind of in the revolution with Stalin, and he was basically just getting rid of people who were powerful so that he could maintain his own power. And what we see with this in this book is it's a very similar setting, except it's just an unnamed dictatorship. And there's an unnamed person at the top called Number One, and we never really get to experience more, hear about him. And Rubashov, this character, was essentially in the high levels of that. He was the one, taking photos with Number One. And similar as to you'll see in the photo on your screen, he's the type of person who would get disappeared because his policies, he was a bit too powerful, people knew him a bit too much. And so it was kind of like, we need to get rid of this guy. So basically he gets put in prison, and he reflects upon his past somewhat fondly, but also guiltily at the same time, about things that were going on, how he behaved, and what he could have done better, what he should have done, thinking about his present situation, how he can somewhat talk his way out of this fix that he's gotten into because he has been in prison before. And it's told all through the eyes of a narrator, really just focused on Rubashov. So everything we see is through what's going on through his mind, his actions. It might slightly deviate to some other characters for a page or two, but it's really quickly back onto him. It's mostly him reflecting, I suppose. There is some dialogue with other characters, which we'll see soon, with tapping on the walls through to other prisoners, and we do have these rather large back and forths between the officers of the prison who are trying to get a confession out of him, these being Ivanov and Gletkin. So it's kind of muted descriptions. Everything in this book, if I was to imagine it in my mind's eye, was very grey, much like you'd kind of expect from the Soviet style architecture from everything back in those times was grey. I'm fully convinced colour did not exist in the Soviet era. And the political language, the dance of language is very, you'll see it soon, where it's just, it's about posturing, it's about politics. It's not about truth, it's not about objectivity. It's all about, how is this going to help me or help this situation? So we've got Cole here, and he's going to give us an example of the kind of considerations, things that go on their minds from page 27 when he is thrown into his cell for the first time.
The corridor was empty. The electric lamps spread their stale, faded light. One did not hear the slightest sound. Why had number 402 become dumb? Probably from fear. He was afraid of compromising himself through Rubashov. Perhaps number 402 was an unpolitical doctor or engineer who trembled at the thought of his dangerous neighbor. Certainly without political experience, else he would not have asked for the name as a start. Presumably mixed up in some affair of sabotage. Has obviously been in prison quite a time already. Has perfected his tapping and is devoured by the wish to prove his innocence. Still in the simple belief that his subjective guilt or innocence makes a difference, and with no idea of the higher interests which are really at stake.
Oof, yeah, so this is a scene where basically Rubashov is in the cell and he's meeting his roommate, number 402, for the first time, and they're doing this tapping, and they've established this system, and as he said, he's really good at it, so they can communicate only through the sound noises of rather than actual speaking, which obviously requires a lot of time, and it's not going to be full long descriptions and back and forths, but maybe there is when you've got 18 hours of your day to just tap back and forth to each other. And what's interesting here is that sentence right near the end where it's not about his subjective guilt or innocence that makes a difference. And I think you could even replace subjective with objective, because it did not matter to this system and to the people within it whether things were subjectively or objectively true or not true. It was about the political considerations. It's it's so disturbing and paradoxical, and it's paradoxical in this really nasty kind of way. It's that sense where it's just like, oh my god, like what? How could anything work in this system if truth doesn't matter and it's all just about what's in your head? It's very strange, very weird, but that does give you a taste into where we go right at the start here. So I'm going to go on to my themes and questions here, and geez, where do you start with this? It is disturbing and exasperating. And so I've got a little formula for you here, and see if you can figure it out, which I'll reveal the ending of it soon, or the final equation. So if you have blind rationality, and then you add political hubris, and then you add dumb brutality, what do you get? So mull over that for a second. The whole philosophy and the people within this book reek of this formula. It just comes out of it. And we see this embodied in I suppose three main characters of this book, this being Rubashov, Ivanov, and Gletkin. So the prisoner himself, and then the two people somewhat not torturing him, although it kind of gets to that, but trying to get a confession out of him. And so Rubashov, he's this blind rationality. He's the thinker of the party. And so he is strict. He is, using his brain, IQ 50,000 to think of his way of thinking of actions and seeing, okay, I'm doing this and this is following the party line for this reason, and so therefore this must happen, and considerations of people's feelings, of how this will affect the world, it's kind of irrelevant. And we have this scene here in the book where he's in a cell and he sees this old guy who was a Navy general or very high up as well, being dragged out of his cell, basically like slumping head, bleeding, a shallow hollow of a man that he used to be, about to get physically liquidated, which was their word for extermination or killing or murder. But no, they preferred physical liquidation because it's kind of a little bit impersonal. And when he sees this for the first time and hears this guy moan out his name, he's kind of like, for the first time ever, like, oh my God, people are actually dying. Oh my God, this is so horrible. I never knew it was, it's just absolutely blind to an absolute fault where it's just disgusting. If you haven't got it yet, I quite dislike this character of Rubashov. Getting on to the political hubris, this is very much Ivanov, where he is this character who's really great at these wheelings and dealings, and you got to think of the political considerations. What is going to happen from this? It doesn't really matter if this happens or that happens, but you need to say this and do this. And he's kind of like also IQ 50,000, maybe slightly less, IQ 40,000, but trying to think ahead and make steps in this direction or that direction. And ultimately he gets it wrong because he himself disappears. And then we finally have Gletkin, which is this dumb brutality. He's the one who's sort of the torturer in this whole thing, where he's described as actually not that smart because he learned to read and write when he was almost later years in his life. And so this is where we get into this section where you see like, okay, what's this combination of these three things that are happening? If you put all this together, it's weird because you look at these people and you'd say, oh man, some of them kind of appear like sociopaths. Like Gletkin, for example, he has no qualms, no remorse about torturing people. Rubashov and Ivanov, kind of. And this is where you probably go, they're probably not all absolute psychopaths. They're probably not all people who take pleasure in hurting other people. And so how did they get into this weird system where they are kind of good at just sacrificing people? Richard, as we heard right at the start in that first quote, he's kind of just like, yeah, we'll get rid of him. Like, it doesn't really matter. Little Loey, Arlova, they're all, sorry, Richard quote comes a little bit later, but in essence, these characters just get thrown aside and without any remorse. And with the political ability, it's easy to put the blame elsewhere and it doesn't really matter. And to answer that formula, what do you get? Blind rationality, political hubris, and dumb brutality. You get the greater good. And so we have this quote here, which I think explains basically what is happening. And this is the quote of Richard.
Rubashov waited to see whether he still had anything to say, but Richard said nothing. Dusk was falling rapidly now. Rubashov took his pince-nez off and rubbed it on his sleeve. The party can never be mistaken, said Rubashov. You and I can make a mistake, not the party. The party, comrade, is more than you and I and 1,000 others like you and I. The party is the embodiment of the revolutionary idea in history. History knows no scruples and no hesitation. Inert and unerring, she flows towards her goal. At every bend in her course, she leaves the mud which she carries and the corpses of the drowned. History knows her way. She makes no mistakes. He who has not absolute faith in history does not belong in the party's ranks.
Yeah. Oof. So it's for the greater good. It's all about this faith and call to the higher power of the party. And this all rests on, we're doing good. This is for the plebeians. We're doing this for the people. This is what the revolution's all about. And there can be no erring. There can be no stopping of the progress that is going forward. And so any minor mishaps, any person who does something bad, or even just events like if a tornado comes through, or if just due to bad weather they're not able to produce enough crops, someone's got to pay for it. There's got to be a reason for this. And it's if bad things happen to people, it's all for this greater purpose, this higher purpose. And this is where you can just start to use some rationality and go, well, like, if humans are, and we know this, and he talks about this here in that quote, you can be mistaken, but the party can never be mistaken. Where does that grounding come from? Because is there something about systems that just naturally make them unavailable, impossible for them to err, to make mistakes? What's the rationale, the grounding behind that? And there is none. It's just, this is the way things are done. This is where it's kind of getting into the power, and it's like, well, you really want to question the revolution, comrade? Okay, yeah, here's a 20-year jail sentence for you. So this is what actually scares me a lot, because I have way less faith in a group than I do in individual beings. Because an individual human, sure, they can cause a lot of havoc, they can kill people, they can do bad things, but they can't kill millions of people. They can't kill tens of millions. They can't kill hundreds of millions of people. But this is what a system like the one described in this book can do, where just people wholesale are getting physically liquidated or put into these prisons. And the longest prolonged suffering, I think this is the worst bit of it, the longest prolonged suffering is instigated by those who are motivated by good, yet are doing evil. And so, because there's kind of staying power. If you think you're doing good, you're willing to put up with privations, you're willing to work super hard. We see Rubashov in this book, he works really hard. He grinds himself to the bone, working and giving his all to the party. And yet he's doing immense harm. And yet he continues to do it because he thinks he's doing good. And what we see eventually is that this is unsustainable, and that people like Gletkin, who is this kind of dumb brute officer, and we'll see in the next quote, he's the result of all of this. He is the kind of final product. So that's the main themes I got from this, which is just, this, I'm not even going to label it communism per se, although this is what the book was somewhat modeled on, at least that the author said that himself in the preface, and the Soviet trials. But this could occur in any kind of political system for sure, and just system where humans get together, and who knows, even in the future, robots perhaps could get into this same sort of bind where it's just immense harm is being done, and yet people think it's doing good, and they're able to justify it. They're able to be, covers over their eyes. They're able to think their ways out of it, or if they're able to just put people who are brutes and unthinking and uncaring into positions of power. All of that just is scary and horrifying for sure. So let's jump, I suppose, onto the author himself, some extra details. He was Hungarian born and had a pretty varied life, to be honest. He grew up mostly in Europe, I think in Austria, and was himself a communist for a fair while. Gallivanted about is what I would say, just judging from the brief bio I read of him during the events of the 1930s, 40s. So he was in Paris when bad stuff was happening with the Nazis, and they were starting to look to invade. And I think he ended up going to getting shipped off to like Africa, and then deserting, and then was back in England and was jailed in England. They got released. Like he had a pretty varied life for sure. And as I think Juan said in the Discord somewhere, the book itself was in the possession of someone else, and I believe it was lost but then refound or something like that. So it had a bit of a history, and he had a history himself. This book in particular, Darkness at Noon, was his most noted work. So if you're new to him like I am, this was I suppose the best place to start if most people talk about this. And the extra detail that I really wanted to get into was, what's the root cause of all this misery and suffering? So we kind of saw the formula of what would end up to be the worst thing that you could possibly imagine, which is things being done for the greater good. It's for this purpose in the future, to take a modern example, if you look at someone like Sam Bankman-Fried, this effective altruist, I'm going to earn all this money, I'm going to do it in kind of underhanded ways, but it's all for the greater good because I'm going to give it all away at the end of my life. And that kind of reasoning you can see is pretty easily like, no, you can't do that. You can't cause misery and suffering now because you're going to make things better in the future, because that's an eventuality. That's not reality. That's just a thing that might happen, and in most cases we see it doesn't happen. So what is the root of all this misery, suffering, wrongdoings? I think it's something like the refusal to treat people as individuals. Throughout this whole book, everyone is a comrade. They're a citizen. They're a number 402 or number 406 in the jail cells. and there is no appeal to them as an individual. And we see this in some of the quotes themselves. So here we have Cole again on page 183, reading out this section.
Apparently, he had reached a state which precluded any deeper emotion. Anyhow, even before he had learned of Ivanov's death, he had been ashamed of that idle feeling of triumph. Glekin's personality had gained such power over him that even his triumphs were turned into defeats. Massive and expressionless, he sat there, the brutal embodiment of the state which owed its very existence to the Rubashovs and the Ivanovs, flesh of their flesh, grown independent and become insensible. Had not Glekin acknowledged himself to be the spiritual heir of Ivanov and the old intelligentsia? Rubashov repeated to himself for the 100th time that Glekin and the new Neanderthalers were merely completing the work of the generation of the numbered heads. That the same doctrine became so inhumane in their mouths had, as it were, merely climatic reasons. When Ivanov had used the same arguments, there was yet an undertone in his voice left by the past by the remembrance of a world which had vanished. One can deny one's childhood, but not erase it. Ivanov had trailed his past after him to the end. That was what gave everything he said that undertone of frivolous melancholy. That was why Glekin had called him a cynic. The Glekins had nothing to erase. They need not deny their past, because they had none. They were born without umbilical cord, without frivolity, without melancholy.
Yes, so we see with this quote here, which was basically getting close towards the end of his torture, and basically the torture was like bright lights being put at him, somewhat actually, like what's going on in the studio in the moment. And he's got these bright lights in his eyes. He's not allowed to sleep at all, so it's not like a physical torturing and like beatings or anything like that, but it's certainly a more psychological / physiological torture, maybe something like that. And we see with this, Gletkin, he's kind of the result of the party and the result of all of this. He is an uncaring, unmovable force of nature. He is just there to do his job, to get the results, to serve the party. And he's not capable of these higher thoughts like Ivanov or like Rubashov. And he is definitely one who does not treat people as individuals. He doesn't care. We get a slight taste of it, like a little bit of sympathy right at the end of the book, but for the most part, no. It's just this uncaring, barbaric way, as you would see. And it's really funny seeing that the Rubashov and Ivanov are somewhat dispirited by him being the successor almost of everything they were trying to do, because there's no sentimentality or melancholy in him, and he somewhat detests the masses when he talks about them, because he's one of them, and he looks at them and he's like, these stupid peasants, when they're in the factories, they used to just sleep on the floor because that's what they used to do, because they had no watches. I got a watch when I was in my 20s. You were born with one. You had one when you were a child. So he had no conception of time, and he's basically, they're doing everything for the masses, but the masses are this vague, ephemeral idea, and none of them are an individual person. Like, we're going to try and help this person, or we're going to try and help this person in particular. It's like, no, we're going to try and help all of you. And if you try and help everyone like that, you can't do anything. And so, I don't know, when I look at this, it just scares me in the sense that probably the antidote to this sort of thing is to treat everyone as individuals. And I'd like to try and embody that in my own life, and I really hate this, especially if you're talking about people in power. And I think this can go the same way. If you're somewhat conspiracy-minded, or rightly or wrongly, if you start talking about they as in the government is just made up of people, and they're individual people at that. And so this is something I battle with myself, and in terms of shifting of individual responsibility as well. This is a good argument, I think, for veganism or vegetarianism of, you're not doing any of the actual killing of the animals. If you were doing that yourself, would you still eat meat? And I think that's a pretty valid question to ask. there's counter arguments to that, and you can have big debates and all that sort of thing. But this is just one of those things where I go, yeah, maybe in my own life I'm kind of shirking some responsibilities, and I would rather not do that, because I think that ends up in situations like we see in this book. So let's get to the final summary, similar books, recommendations. The ending of this book is noteworthy for how shallow it is. It's basically a morally bankrupt man in Rubashov deciding to finally muse of what could have been. So in particular, he's basically capitulated. He's confessed to everything. He's going to start doing these like show trials himself, and he's not going to cause a ruckus or a scene. He's just kind of accepted his fate. And he's in a cell, and he finally gets a little bit of sleep, and then he starts thinking about this, what could have been. He could have been an astronomer if he hadn't fallen into the party, and because he had this curiosity as a child and this oceanic feeling, which I don't know where the hell that came from, but he starts talking about that. And all I can think is, who cares what this dude has to say? There can be no repentance for what he's done, because he created this monster of a machine, this beast. He willfully looked away when he had individual opportunities multiple times, 3 in the book being these characters who he somewhat sacrificed for the party, for the revolution, when he could have saved them. Just with a word of his voice, he could have saved them, but he chose not to, because he wanted to survive, because he needed to be there for the party in the future, because he was important, and because he was doing the most good. And so I just looked at, every opportunity for individual courage he misses, and it scares me. It scares me because he's not a psychopath. He's not a person who you can really look at and go, he's a bad person. You can say that, I think, after looking at his life, and you're like, okay, he did a lot of bad things, not necessarily like physically himself, but what he helped to create and what he avoided looking at was really bad. And yet here he is right at the end of his life being like, la-di-da, like, oh, if only things could have been slightly different. I could have been an astronomer. And it's just like, shut up, man. Who gives a fuck? Who gives what you think? But, maybe it scares me because it could be me. Because I certainly see like portions of myself in him. He's not unrelatable, but I definitely just go, man, he's a dude who made all the wrong decisions. And nothing can make up for it. No matter how much he is punished, nothing can make up for the millions of lives that he himself has ruined through his actions. And so, it leaves a sour taste in the end, the ending, where it's just like him reflecting, and who cares? Who cares what this dude thinks? Other than that, the book I found was merely okay. I didn't really connect with anyone. Like I said, I prefer when I can connect with a character, and I didn't hate Rubashov, but I certainly, there was many instances where I'm just like, this dude, gets me annoyed for sure. The topics were somewhat interesting. I do like this aspect of diving into the paradox of how they're able to use politics and justify doing really bad things, but just the way the book presented it, it didn't capture me as much as I thought it probably would. So, and like I said, he had all these backtrackings in the point. If it had just been him in the cell without these flashbacks, I think I probably would have enjoyed it more, but that was just me, myself. So overall, I'm giving the book a 5.5 out of 10. Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler. I can't really say like you have to go out and read it or anything like that. If I had to say similar books recommendations, it's hard to go past things which are really good, like 1984 by George Orwell, my favorite book of all time. The Gulag Archipelago. I've only read the abridged version of that, but even that was like, knock your socks off in terms of the stories, and that one is a non-fiction book of by I'm not sure I want to say his name, Solzhenitsyn. A couple of other things, maybe even stylistic elements of this, like Franz Kafka's The Trial, seep into it a little bit, because it is this back and forth political wheeling dealings, paradox, things don't really make sense. So a couple of little things there to get you interested. I'm going to jump onto my Boostagram Lounge section. So this is where I thank some people for helping to support the show. And we did get a Boostagram in this week, which is really encouraging. I love seeing that. So this one was from, who else but Petar the Slav. he said the movie adaptation of this book was pretty good. Daniel Day-Lewis, Foam Finger, #1 for the win. Well, he didn't say for the win, but I added that. 2,222 sats. That is a row of ducks sent using Fountain. And yeah, so that's a message sent directly via a podcasting app in support of this show and thanking me and Cole and everyone who was in the splits to create this. So much appreciated, Peter. Thank you, first of all. And yeah, first of all, Daniel Day-Lewis, amazing actor. Everything that I've seen him in, he's just knocked my socks off. And maybe that's because apparently he's renowned as doing only a couple of films, but really choosing them for that. So yeah, I might need to watch that movie at some point. And so that was for the Last of the Mohicans book review from last week. So thank you very much for that. That was the only Boostagram that we've got in. Once again, I do enjoy comments, particularly in this form. So if you go to meremortalspodcast.com/support, you'll be able to see the different apps and the ways that we're doing it. There's a little QR code on your screen at the moment. I think someone's already claimed this. So maybe for the next one, I'll put it up again where you have the ability to just scan that or type in the link if you're in the podcasting apps themselves, and you can get a 2,000 Satoshis and the little onboarding experience onto the Lightning Network and Bitcoin. I get it. It's all super difficult. It's all new and makes no sense. But if you go to meremortalspodcast.com/support, once again, I've got a bit of an explanation there of everything that is going on. So finally, the Value for Value podcast. So this is what this podcast is, the model. You will never hear ads. You will never hear sponsorships. I am not getting paid by any of these authors to do these book reviews. I follow my passions. I follow my interests, my intrigues. I follow recommendations that you give at home to me for great books to read and to review. So this is as unbiased as I can make them, these book reviews, but it does require money to create this, and time and energy. And so I just ask that for all this value that I'm putting up front, you never have to support, you never have to contact me in any way. I certainly would like if you could give me some back. And there's many different ways you can do this. Sharing the podcast, if you're on YouTube, hitting the like, the subscribe, the bell notification, all those things to know when I go live. And letting a friend know, hey, there's this really cool podcast channel about book reviews. He did one on this book you might enjoy, or you might enjoy it if you do this. You've got some exams coming up. What are some of the themes of this book you might enjoy? I can do all that for you, So that is one way you can do it. You can give me some talent. This is giving me book recommendations. I would love to know what you think of these books, or parts that I may have missed, of ideas, themes, questions which I glossed over, of stylistic elements that I might have missed. I would love to know all of your thoughts and opinions on these. Once again, you can do that via social media, or you could do that via Boostagram, which you can do within the podcasting app. It just makes sense. I put a ton of effort into the chapters, to the transcripts, into mostly going live on this. I wasn't able to this week because technical issues. So all of those sorts of things, I very much appreciate if you could do any of them. This podcast just relies on your support and feedback. So if I don't get any, it will eventually go away. But when we have people like Peter donating in, and obviously people like Cole, who's providing immense value with his voice acting chops and reading out these quotes, it's super, super fun, enjoyable, and I do hope to start to incorporate a little bit of music into this as well in the future. So we're going to leave it there for today. Thank you everyone for joining in. What is next week's book review going to be? It's one you might not expect from me because it's somewhat political, and it's Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky, and I've actually forgotten the other author's name. I should probably check that up right now. So Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman. So yeah, it's a bit of a thick book. So Cole, if you're listening, the quotes might come a little bit later than usual. Apologies, but I'll try and do that in any case. And that is all about how the mass media is essentially a propaganda machine. I very much subscribe to that view myself. And he's got a lot of examples in the book. They have a lot of examples of how they do this. And what's really interesting, it's from 1984, I believe, the book. So all of the examples are of things which are kind of done in the past, talking about the Sandinistas, about the Contras in Nicaragua and El Salvador and Guatemala and places like that. So it's kind of interesting in terms of like being a historical context as well. So that's what's coming up for next week. Thank you everyone for joining in. Please join me for a live book review on Thursday mornings, Australian Eastern Standard Time at 10 a.m. And ciao for now. Karen out.